Starting with stepping. All right, ready to roll.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Wave. Let me know you're happy today. Smile. Thank you. It's always nice to have a receptive audience. All right. Let's do our roll. Kelly.
Here.
Thanks, Kelly. Norma. Michelle.
I'm here.
Hello. Ashley Chase. Don't see her. Anna. I see Anna. Okay. She's here.
Yep.
Brian Cotter. Dennis. Janelle. Dave Hayes. Chelsea.
Chelsea's trying to join. She'll be here soon.
Okay, great. Kevin.
Here.
Hello.
How are you?
Good, thank you. Dave Lee. Renee.
Yep, here.
Beth. I know Beth is here. Brandon.
I'm here.
Hello. Becky.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you.
Good morning, Becky. Elizabeth.
I'm here.
Hi. Lynette. Timothy. And Jana. Okay, thank you all. We're going to go through our usual process here. All of you should be in possession of meeting minutes and recaps from the May 1st, 2024 meeting. I am going to first of all begin with our prevention subcommittee. So prevention subcommittee members. I will be asking for various motions from you first. You received two documents. The first were the meeting minutes for our prevention subcommittee on May 1st, 2024. Are there any corrections or edits that need to be made to those meeting minutes? Okay, I see no one. All right, if we could have a motion and a second to approve the prevention subcommittee meeting minutes, please.
I motion to approve.
Thanks, Brandon. A second, please, from our prevention subcommittee.
This is Jenna. I can second.
Thanks, Jenna. All right. Is there any opposition to approval of those meeting minutes by the prevention subcommittee group? All right, I see none, and those meeting minutes will pass. Prevention subcommittee, we're now working on the meeting recap document. Same questions. Are there any additions or corrections that need to be made to that document? I'm scanning. I see no one. All right. I see nothing that needs to be changed. So if we could have a motion and a second from our prevention subcommittee members to approve this document, please.
A motion to approve.
Thank you, Brandon. And a second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Becky. All right. Then seeing no objections, is there anybody, well, I should ask, are there any objections to the approval of these minutes? Or the meeting recap, sorry, too many documents. All right, seeing none. Prevention subcommittee, you did a fantastic job. Your meeting minutes and recaps are officially approved. Moving on to the same process for our intervention subcommittee group. Focused first, again, on the meeting minutes of May 1st of 2024. Are there any corrections that need to be made to those meeting minutes from our intervention subcommittee? I see none. All right. If we could again have a motion and a second to approve those meeting minutes by our intervention subcommittee members.
Beth, I'll motion to approve.
Thank you. And if we could get a second.
Second, since I was there last month.
Thank you, Kevin. All right. Is there anybody who is opposed to the passage or approval of those meeting minutes by the intervention subcommittee? I see no opposition. Those will go ahead and pass. Moving on to the same process for the meeting recap by, again, our intervention subcommittee. Any changes to the meeting recap document? Okay, seeing none, same process. If we could have a motion and a second to approve that document by our intervention subcommittee members.
Aye. Well,
Thanks, Kevin. We'll have you as the first. Who's our second?
Beth, I can second.
Thank you, Beth. All right. Is anybody opposed to the approval of the intervention subcommittee meeting recap? And I see none. Congratulations, your documents are approved. One final little document, it's just the general meeting minutes that just laid out the outline and the format for our total meeting. It's pretty straightforward, but in the interest of getting it all done properly, are there any corrections or changes to those general meeting minutes from May 1 of 2024? All right, I see none. So last, if we could have a motion and a second to approve these general meeting minutes, please. If you attended the meeting, just jump right in.
This is Jenna. I'll approve.
Thank you, Jenna. Second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Beth. All right. Is there any opposition to the passage of that general meeting minutes? Thank you. Those will pass as well. All right, Trace, on to you.
All right, cool. Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm tired today. Go Nuggets. Anybody watch the game last night? Okay. All right. Avs game tonight. Anybody watching that? Not feeling as hopeful, but I love that. Thank you, Brandon. Denver sports keeping me up late right now. All right, y'all. Well, good morning. Excited to continue the conversation today. We've got a 2-hour meeting. So appreciate y'all hanging in. We'll try to get you a few minute break in between if we can. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to remind us of kind of where we are in our process. So appreciate y'all jumping in. I know this was an added meeting to our original schedule just to get things finished. So thanks for being here. So we're going to stay full group today, and we're going to go through where the subcommittees have been over the last few meetings. This is adding an additional step as typical because we just need more conversation to be able to create some great recommendations come out of this group as it relates to these two conversations. So that's what we're doing today. So there was no review, I guess is my short point there. June 12th, we're going to be back into our subcommittees. Again, we'll be moving on to education on trauma-informed recovery and education on risks of running. We'll have an opportunity to move folks around, I believe, as necessary. But yeah, appreciate y'all jumping back in for that. July will be, again, this is also assuming that we can get where we need to go. In July, we'll come back full group, and that date is off here. If somebody wants to remind me of what that July date is while I'm talking, that would be fantastic. Thank you. I know it's at the end of July. We had to move it from the 3rd because nobody said they wanted to be here on July 3rd. And then August, we'll come back full group. We'll be talking about foster care specific recommendations as it relates to conversations to date. So excited about that conversation. And that really came from conversations we've had that we recognize that some of these recommendations need a specific conversation as it relates to how this applies in more of a foster care situation than facility situation. And then in August and September, we'll be working through our recommendations and finalizing our report. So that's kind of where we're at. Any questions there? Did somebody grab that? Somebody drop the July date in for me?
July 31.
July 31. Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Any questions on process? All right, cool.
Trace, I just had one thing to add.
Jordan, yeah, please.
All right. So I think we're 3 hours today. I think we're going to 11.
Oh, my bad.
Sorry, I'll be the bearer of bad news. Sorry, everyone. We have a 3-hour one. The only thing I wanted to update on is
You're right. I said that wrong.
no worries. Just wanted to add the facility survey will be going out. Thank you, Becky and Brandon, for all of your work on that. Brian and I will be collecting and analyzing those results so that when we move into the final review and discussion of the report, you'll have that on hand to help guide as well. So just wanted to give a quick update because I know we discussed that a while ago and I didn't want folks to think that we had completely dropped it off the map.
Cool. Thanks for that reminder. So we'll get you more than a 5-minute break. That's my bad. So just plan on a break around 9:30. Just so you all know, we'll get you about 15 minutes there. All right. So we're gonna start with the prevention subcommittee today, and I've got a few slides, and I've talked to a couple of members that I'm gonna have kind of go through where we're at. But again, just a reminder today, because we're not quite at the spot where we've been able to draft recommendations out of the conversations, we're gonna try and catch full group up as to where we think the conversation is as far as we've gotten with the subcommittee group. We've got some themes to kind of pull from each group, and then really we're going to open this up. So if you're in the subcommittee and you're like, I want to keep going on additional points, totally fine. But also this is for the context of the other group that it's like, here's where we've gotten. And so we're not starting from like square one as far as the conversation around restraint goes. So with that, just going to share a few slides and kind of catch us up to speed. All right, so here's the directive that and I'll drop these in here in just a minute as well so that folks can remember, kind of navigate through as you want. But here's the directive that this group's really wrestling with around restraint. So analyze the comprehensiveness and effectiveness of existing state laws and regulations and placement facility protocols to respond to a child's threat to run away from out-of-home placement and for promptly reporting, locating, evaluating, and treating children who have run away. So the question here, subject to the provisions of this article, an agency may only use restraint or seclusion on an individual, 1, in cases of emergency, and I have that definition of emergency below that the group is working from, and 2, after the failure of less restrictive alternatives or after a determination that such alternatives would be inappropriate or ineffective. So current definition of emergency, and you're going to hear a little bit more about this around kind of where the group landed on this, but current definition of emergency as it relates in statute means a serious, probable, imminent threat of bodily harm to self or others where there is the present ability to effect such bodily harm. The question that we're really wrestling with today, and the question that this is really a slide from the previous conversations with the subcommittee, is does Colorado law currently provide enough clarity regarding what constitutes an emergency situation in which physical restraint is appropriate? So that's really what we're asking. That's really what where these things kind of tease out. We did the survey with the group. I just wanted to remind the full group of kind of where the subcommittee landed with these kind of 2 key questions. So does it provide necessary clarity? Over half of the subcommittee said, no, it does not. The second question is currently drafted is Colorado's law regarding the use of restraints effective at preventing children and youth from running away from out-of-home care? And 71% of the group said, no, it is not. So that's kind of where the group was starting from in our conversations. These points right here, I'm going to have Stephanie and Brandon as well. Stephanie, I'm going to ask to kind of really run through these as far as where the group, to date has kind of landed. These are kind of some high level themes, if you will, of what emerged and what really the conversation is coalescing around. So Stephanie, I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of walk through these. And Brandon, I know that you've had a conversation as well and appreciate you jumping in where needed. But yeah, I just wanted someone from the group itself to really be able to talk through like, what was the conversation and what are we kind of landing on and what are we really looking from the full group today to really dig into?
Great. I can start us off. Yeah. It's a big conversation, which is why I'm stumbling a tad around it. Yeah, for everybody's background, obviously Trace has read the directive and what it is that we're trying to define or clarify. And I would just say that first of all, just to give a tiny bit of background, that there were certainly some members of our group that believe that there is a lack of clarity on what constitutes an emergency and imminent for purposes of administering a restraint on youth. Task force members basically said, one of 2 things can happen because of this lack of clarity in their minds. is that one, staff take no effort to keep a child from running, which in turn can place a child in serious danger or harm when they leave and they're on their own, and can result potentially even in legal liability. The other thing that can happen is if you actually restrain a young person, it also can still cause injury and harm to both staff and the youth. And that too can lead to legal liability, right? So, this was the general discussion is what is the definitions, do the definitions of imminent and emergency provide enough guidance to facilities to restrain youth when they run from care? And I'm leaving this as an open conversation. I don't believe our team came to consensus on these issues. Rather, we had a really robust debate about whether these laws are indeed in need of clarification. So I want to be upfront about that. Essentially, and much of this is in your meeting minutes as well, we identified essentially 5 points, which are in Trace's, the slide that she put up. And I'm just going to pose these as the questions that we raised in the conversations we had. And so the first conversation we had is about the definition of emergency itself. Specifically, should it include runaway behavior? There was discussion by team members that anytime a child runs, it is an emergency. Like these youth are in certain facilities for very high level reasons. They struggle with a lot of various challenges. And so should even runaway behavior constitute part of the definition of emergency? That was one issue. The second issue that came up was the definition of imminent. And what is imminent, right? Does it mean like there's a threat of harm in this exact moment? Or can it be based on a staff member's cumulative knowledge of what they know about this child, perhaps their mental health diagnoses, past behaviors, combined with a current threat, right? So that definition was also deemed to be at least potentially unclear as well. The third point that came up, and I need to back up a minute, Trace, sorry. When we were talking about the definitions, all these definitions, Brandon shared with us quite a bit of legal research that he had done, his group had done regarding these terms. So we have this in statute, what's in front of you, but we also have a whole lot of case law that interprets statute. And I think it's just important to, as we think about whether the statute needs to be clarified, does it need to incorporate actual case law that is out there on certain of these principles? So when it went to the definition of eminent, for example, Brandon had shared with us some case law that indicates that, in fact, eminent doesn't have to be right in that exact immediate minute, right? And that, in fact, eminent danger is relative. It's not absolute. And it is more measured by the nature of consequences than the lapse of time. So I just give you that by way of some of our discussion. The third principle that came up was this duty to intervene. Also, again, we had case law that was discussed about the fact that there is basis in law for facilities that are responsible for caring for individuals with whatever health issues, behavioral health or otherwise, their duty to intervene when you accept a patient into your care and you agree that you're going to take care of this patient and keep them safe and to treat them, then you need to keep them safe and you have to do that in order to treat them. So there is some case law out there. Again, this is a lapse or an omission in Colorado law. The fourth point that was discussed was this good faith requirement. And this was more of a general conversation, not based in case law. But essentially, it was this notion that facilities want there to be not a strict liability here, right? That they want the ability to say, we've done assessments of this youth, we understand their background, and when they made this threat, we decided it was in everyone's interest that we keep the youth from running. And right now, at least there was some notion that facilities at times feel like it's a strict liability thing, right? Unless it happens in this exact minute, you shouldn't be imposing a restraint, when in fact, they're like, in good faith, we know this child, right? We've been working with this child. There needs to be some acknowledgement of our knowledge of this youth. And finally, we had a discussion about hands-off policies. We learned in our group that apparently there are some facilities that take that as a general approach. And it also came to our knowledge that that is not a commonly known thing. And that if it is not already addressed in law and regs, that parents, custodians of a youth should be advised of what a facility's policies are, because a parent or custodian might not otherwise even place their child in a facility if they knew that there was a complete hands-off policy. So those were our 5 main points. And Brandon, I'd urge you to jump in here if I've missed something.
No, I think you covered it well. Uh, the only thing I would add is the informing of parents. I think it's very relevant to the running situation, and I think most of us organizations don't have policies or inform individuals that it's very strict around not going hands-on currently, and I think that could be very confusing to the expectations of stakeholders and families.
Yeah, and Stephanie, the one thing I would just add for context for the full group is that I don't think you said this, but I just wanted to make sure folks knew there was a panel in the last group with a variety of providers statewide, in addition to including our very own Dennis and Brandon on the panel. But we had a number of folks kind of come in to help really just kind of say, like, what does this actually mean for, like, what are the challenges that we're facing? So a lot of these conversations really also I think we're in response to that panel in the last conversation. So just wanted for folks to know that conversation did happen.
Thanks, Trace. The only other thing I would also add is that our group spent 2 meetings on this. We met both on April 10th and May 1st. So just by way of giving a little bit of I condensed, I think, 4 hours of meetings into about 10 minutes. So there's a lot here that, a lot of nuance that I think we can still consider and be discussed. And I just wanted to let members know that.
So I think, Stephanie, what would be helpful is to, really what we want to do is, well, one, subcommittee members, in addition, again, I've dropped the slides in so you could follow that way, but it's also nice to just see everybody's faces. So kind of toggling between the two. So please open up those slides if helpful. But as we're looking at these kind of 5 themes or kind of topics to kind of open back up to the full group, want to make sure from our subcommittee members that there's nothing that I know, Brandon, you had a chance to just say in addition to, but just want to make sure that somebody else isn't like, whoa, you're missing something. Again, best stab at pulling out the kind of the things that stuck with the full group. Anything that you would add from your perspective? Brian, go ahead.
I'm not a subcommittee member, but
I was like,
I
you
just
weren't in
think
there.
just I know that in Stephanie's summary, she talked about how the youth who are being placed in these facilities are already of a special category. But just to remind folks that we've already had recommendations approved that would nod towards creating multi-tiered categories of risk of running from care. And then creating tailored responses to youth based on the category that's used for them. So that when we think about these topics today, we can think about how that would interact with those previous recommendation areas.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. It's helpful. All right, so let's jump into. I think the way we're thinking about this, the way I'm thinking about this, is going through each of those 5 more intentionally now, since we don't have any kind of additions, and then with Brian's context in mind, opening up for full group discussion around kind of where folks are. Again, our goal here is that we're looking to draft either recommendations or strong guidance from this group as far as it relates to this directive. And so just want to make sure we're getting specific, we're getting clear on what folks want to see, what's anything we're missing, and where, particularly in these topics, where you're landing. So Stephanie, I'm going to kind of keep picking on you as we go through each of these 5 to just kind of, again, level set, like, what's the latest iteration of this conversation? And then let's open it up for folks for questions, additional points, and let's have a dialogue around each. So I'm talking around, so again, we're on slide, the last slide of that group. So the first one here is really this definition of emergency. And should it include runaway behavior was a question that the kind of group kept wrestling with. So Stephanie, I want to bring you back, diving a little deeper than the headlines you just gave. Where do you see this conversation as it relates to definition of emergency, and what are we really wrestling with here, and what do we want this group to really be responding to?
Yeah, I mean, Brandon, I would ask you to jump in because I believe you raised this point in particular. But I think just generally, right, the nature of young people who have a variety of again, various behavioral health challenges, intellectual developmental disabilities, et cetera, by virtue are a risk when they run into the street, right? Or they leave a facility unattended by an adult. And so should runaway behavior be inherently considered an emergency? That was my takeaway, but Brandon, please jump in. Because as a facility and as a provider, I know that the analysis goes far deeper in terms of just the type of youth that you're seeing, the high acuity levels, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think the there has to be an agreed upon consensus that what is an emergency, what is a person in crisis. And I think I firmly believe that fleeing is an evidence, and an irrational state of mind is an evidence of an emergency, and it is a safety issue. That's my perspective on this. But I think that either way, I think there has to be clarity around it. Are we is the state of Colorado considering that an emergency or not? I don't think I'm not saying that necessarily always grants the right for a physical restraint, and I think that's where people get lost, and then that's when they say runaway behavior isn't emergency, or it doesn't qualify for a restraint because they look at it through the lens, oh, we don't want people to restrain for runaways. Well, to me, that's a different subject matter on what you're allowed to do to, or what is appropriate to intervene on that emergency. But I do think there has to be an agreement or a consensus on, do we, as a industry, consider running away behavior for kids that are placed at these, at any point, actually, to be honest with you, anywhere, is that an emergency? And are kids in crisis when they're doing those things? I would argue yes, they are.
Thanks for that, Brandon. Renee, saw you jump in, and then I want to come back to some of those points. Go ahead, Renee.
Yeah, I just I don't think what I'm saying differs necessarily from what Brandon was saying, but I think just a different perspective on the semantics of it. I would be concerned about defining runaway behavior as an emergency. I'm not sure that's what the group was leaning towards, which is different than saying, could some instances of runaway behavior be an emergency? And I'm seeing Brandon nodding, so that's what I anticipated too. So I'd be very concerned if the suggestion is to say just running absolutely is an emergency, because I don't think that's what we are feeling.
Yeah, I think the maybe the difference, Renee, there would be the caveat of like could include, right? Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, in which
any
case,
sort of language recommendation of like this could include, right, on a case by case basis. It sounds like it was what you're saying. The running behavior that could be part of it, or also it could not.
it seems to me that's what's in question from the group. If I take away from the group conversation is, and then I think then there's a separate question: is should statute ever be naming specific things, or like Brandon is saying, sort of the interpretation of what constitutes an emergency. You know, is it more clinical judgment? And then that's, you know, something to be, you know, to be addressed. So, you know, starting to list things in statutes can, in terms of like, this could be an emergency or this could be an emergency, you know, can lead down paths that can be difficult.
Okay. I want to, Kevin, go ahead, Doris, and then,
Yeah, my question is, what are some examples of when running is not an emergency?
I would say that, I mean, there are kids who are known to walk away and just want to walk down the block and walk back. Like, that's not someone you would want to say that's an emergency. And if it's an emergency, then X, Y, and Z then is now allowable.
But isn't that a permission issue? Isn't that a matter of permission? If they have permission to walk down the block and walk back, then that's, you know, then that's not running away, really.
The vast majority of our runs are not emergencies. The kid leaves and comes back unharmed.
Brandon, I'm curious. Well, Dennis, I'd be curious to know, when you say vast majority, is that from like a data perspective? Is that like, what does
So,
that statement come from? And then Brandon, I'm curious anecdotally if you would agree with that from your perspective too.
yeah, I mean, we get the critical incidents on runaways. The kids run and they come back. I mean, it comes back to we've had this discussion a lot about why are kids running. It looks from our perspective like the majority of runs are kids need a break from the facility or feel like they need a break from the facility and they leave and then they come back.
Brandon, kind of curious from your perspective, how does that?
Well, I definitely don't disagree with the statement that Dennis made that, you know, I think that the outcomes often are that, you know, that they return and, you know, aren't injured per se. I think it comes down to, you know, again, we're talking about a certain segment and percentage of the kids, of those kids, and what the potential, you know, harm can be to those kids out there in a lot of cases. Um, and I also think that, like, when we're talking about situations that the physical restraint would be involved, I think it would directly be proportional to, you know, also what Dennis is talking about as well. I don't think, like, just because, you know, there's certain situations a kid needs, you know, to be stopped doesn't mean every time a kid walks out that a kid's going to be physically stopped. It just means, you know, that you're, again, what I like, Renee said it better than I did, you know, that this is evidence and can be evidence or could be evidence of a kid in a situation that it does constitute an emergency. And I think that does not mean, you know, I don't want the lens to be like that the only thing you can do is go to a physical restraint. I think it's one tool, you know, right now currently in our system, but like you do have to act upon it. And I think when we underplay it, and that it's not just because we know that they could come back, you know, safely, that gives people permission not to do everything in their power to stop it. And I think that like that's where the guidance needs to come in play, even though, you know, it's only a percentage of kids that get trafficked or get kidnapped or get hurt or, you know, so, or pick up charges or offend on somebody else. I agree that's the minority of all the volume, but it still happens. And to me, it's not about, you know, the total amount of percentages being overwhelming. It's about stopping every, you know, unsafe thing, trying to do our best to, you know, prevent every unsafe situation to happen, even if it's just one kid out there.
Yeah, Brandon, I'm hearing like the differentiation between like the intent of a kid doesn't necessarily equate the threat of like the emergency is kind of what I heard. Like, right, like a kid might be intending to walk down the block, but that doesn't mean that no risk is associated with
Or
them.
danger. And are they in an
Danger. Right.
appropriate, are they in an appropriate mindset, even when they're doing that, to be able to, and they're capable of even be able to protect themselves or do things,
Okay.
you know, out there that would make the right choices that would not put them in harm's way. And that's really where I think when you look at a clinical judgment of individual kids, you know, in those situations has to be determined by the caretaker. And that's always been, you know, my argument. But to say, like, right now it's an, you know, absolute, like, you know, hey, your kid runs, all you can do is really talk to him and keep eyes on, call the police. Like, I don't think that's good. I also don't think I'm not an advocate to say that every time a kid is trying to run that you go hands on either. I think this is where you go back to that it's a tool, but there's appropriate times to use it and there's appropriate times not to use it. And there's, you know, but there's no question in my mind that that is a serious situation. And when a kid is in a high, you know, irrational state, especially at the tier placements, that running away is an emergency. And because the dangers are significant to these kids and others, actually.
All right, thanks, Brandon. That's helpful to hear that. I just want to make sure I was understanding the kind of the difference in what you were saying. Michelle, I'm curious to hear your perspective in a minute. Dorsey, I know Doris has had her hand up. So, Doris, you go, but then Michelle, just wanted to kind of cue you up. I'd be curious from your perspective, county perspective, and yeah, just knowing how you all are doing things down there. So, Doris, go ahead, and then Michelle, come to you.
Awesome, thank you. So one of the things that I'm sitting with in this question around whether and in what situations runaway youth, the act of running away could constitute an emergency, is sort of thinking about not necessarily whether and how the law should reflect, whether, you know, this task force should put forth a recommendation around a law change. But it sounds like they're, you know, folks are thinking about this idea that in some situations, the act of running away could constitute an emergency. And maybe there should be some inclusion of some language that reflects that. But the other thing that I'm holding is that I think that clinical judgment is really important in informing the situation and the extent to which a youth running away from care is an emergency, and also the reality that, you know, when we think about equitable interventions and when a youth of color runs away or is missing, the evaluation of the associated risk or attention to that young person does in fact vary by identity. And so I think there may be a place, not in statute, but maybe in you know, sort of some policy implications around some of the considerations that would go into the evaluation of risk for a youth that runs away. And that also includes considerations to ensure that there is equitable attention to young people, to ensure that kids of color, for instance, get the same attention as other kids when they run away. So that's all I got, Trace.
Yeah, thanks, Doris. Seeing a lot of head nods there. Michelle, I'm gonna come to you, then Kevin and Lynette.
So is it, and like in regard to like what Douglas County is doing around emergencies and runaways and stuff, or?
No, just your thoughts. I think on this conversation, I'm just kind of curious on the like, you know, what you see folks as it relates to the conversation, the comments Brandon was making, just general like reaction thoughts.
Fun fact, dealing with this right now, my worker is spiraling a little bit. So I'm trying to like talk her down because lots of stuff is happening. I think Dennis had a really great point. I think a lot of the kids that we have that quote run, like, are literally taking space. They go off campus, they go off site, they go to Walmart, they go like, and sometimes they're running with a friend and then they come back. Is it scary? Yes. Is it unsafe? Yes. Is it an emergency? I don't think so. I think we also have kids who, are in the milieu and they're making self-harming statements and they're raging and they're throwing things and then they decide to run. That to me is more of the emergency. I think more things need to be in place for that youth versus a kid who's like, I've had a bad day, right? I just need to get some air. So I do think that there's the two different kinds of kids and the way they leave versus run, I guess.
So sounds like your comments kind of land in the could camp. It could be,
Yeah.
but okay.
But I also really struggle with the physical restraint when you have a kid who's so out of control. We've seen when you put hands on that kid, it gets worse, right? They get injuries, the staff gets injuries. But what else are you supposed to do in that moment to keep that kid safe? I struggle with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate that. Kevin and then Lynette.
Yeah, my experience is narrow, and that's as a parent. And unfortunately, I absorbed several calls from facilities over the years saying your kid has run, he's not in our care, he's not in our jurisdiction. And as a parent, 100% of the time, that's an emergency. My world is rocked. If I'm at work, if it's in the middle of the night, I'm devastated. And usually I'm out the door and trying to figure out how to find him because I know no one else is looking at him. So in my world, as a parent, 100% of the time I received those phone calls, I considered a dire emergency. But then I also knew that my son, many times would not just come back, was not going, so I had that knowledge about my son. And in many cases, he was allowed to walk away because the facility felt like we can't touch him, we can't stop him. We are trained to stop them in a couple of cases, but we're not allowed because that's risk to us, the facility. And in a couple of cases, the police are the ones that had to stop him, and that was ugly. So that's kind of where I'm coming from as a parent.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think that highlights for me too, I'm hearing the two things. One is the could piece, language that around that. And then two, is this is going to get into this, we're going to get into this also with this professional judgment piece. And I think that's what Becky's referencing in the chat, or that's what I would draw that to is, knowing the kid, knowing the case, knowing the situation, knowing that kid goes to Walmart, knowing that kid is actually more regulated, et cetera, that there is potential, that there's space for that professional judgment piece. So I'm curious where that conversation gets, just naming that we're kind of overlapping a little bit. So Lynette, I want to come to you, and then we've got, a number of points here to really kind of hone in on. So I want to keep us moving through because I think there's a lot of overlapping here. And then Jordan, I'm just thinking also from I want to touch base with you too and just kind of see where we're at. But I think we're getting somewhere as far as what this group is wrestling with. So Lynette, go ahead, and then let's Stephanie, I'm going to come back to you to kind of highlight our next the next kind of piece we're talking through. Go ahead, Lynette. Lynette, I can't hear you. Can anybody else hear her? Okay.
Sorry, every time I switch platforms, I have to change my camera and my speakers. Right now, we're dealing with 2 youth that are IDD and will just take off. And unfortunately, they tend to go into other people's homes, pick up their infants, run in traffic. That's a different level of running that creates a higher risk, a safety concern, than a lot of our kids that are just angry and need a break and need to walk away and cool down. I think we have to make sure that whatever our recommendations are, is that it's flexible enough for facilities to assess each youth and I would almost recommend that they include in their treatment plan, what's their plan for if this youth starts running based on that youth's needs and risk factors. And then that way, those types of things could be included in it, and they get to think about it before it happens. That's my 2 cents worth.
Thanks, Lynette. Dennis, go ahead.
Statute prohibits the use of putting restraint into a treatment plan. You can't do it. It explicitly prohibits that.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're.
I'll have to find the exact statute. I don't think I have it written down right here.
No, sorry,
Statute,
I just mean generally what you're, so you're saying,
yes, Colorado state statutes prohibit the application of restraints into treatment plants. You can't. It's illegal.
so then that's not where it would be. So I guess that's maybe then the point where that statute around, or that the clarity of what emergency is needs to be
It-
more specifically defined, because you wouldn't have that in an individual treatment plan for one child. Is that?
Right. You can't. It's illegal. You can't have it in an individual treatment plan. There's a whole section of statute that talks about that. That's basically the title would be like like the right to be free from restraint and seclusion, basically. And one of the components of that statute is that it cannot be written into a specific treatment plan that a facility will restrain a youth under certain circumstances.
Dennis, is this the section you're referring to in 262103? I just threw it in the chat. I'm just trying to lock
It
this
could
down.
be. I have it written down somewhere, but I don't have it right here in front of me. So
Okay, I'll follow up with you just so we can get that, because I know that
okay.
that keeps coming up, and I want to make sure we're all looking at that same provision, that prohibition.
Elizabeth, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so we've already talked in the intervention group about a tiered response and what high risk, low risk looks like for those kiddos. And so I'm not saying that when they're admitted to the facility, we're recommending use restraint in the runaway situation. But if we've already assessed them using these tools that we're recommending in the other group, right? And we know that this kiddo falls into a high risk category for how we're going to respond if they run, then why doesn't that carry over to prevention? So that we already know they're high risk in this category, and that constitutes an emergency if they run, allowing providers then to utilize whatever tools they have available, including restraints.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I think it's important to call in, and Stephanie's seen kind of the overlap, yeah, with our other recommendations. I think this is, Jordan, I would say this is helpful as far as drafting goes. Is there any, before I move us on, I just want to make sure I'm.
No, I think we have plenty to get drafting on this point. There's just a few follow-up points I'll do individually, and then I think we can move on to Trace.
Okay, great. All right, Stephanie, I'm gonna pick on you again for the second piece here to just do some level setting for us on the definition of imminent, and where the group was really kind of like not necessarily wrestling, but talking through. So should it allow for a staff member to rely upon all information in their possession, as well as a current ability to execute on a threat to run away? So I think this really gets at that professional judgment piece that I was kind of referencing earlier as well.
Yeah, this is in our group. I think that we had some folks who just disagreed, right, or have different interpretations of what it means. What is the word eminent, right? And as I again was just reading through some of the case law, on one side of the equation, right, and I'm just going to send a couple quotes out to you. The word imminent threat is defined in Colorado case law as likely to happen without delay, impending, and threatening. And then in another piece of case law, the following was: the fact that the harm is not to occur immediately is not to say that the harm is not imminent. Imminent danger is relative, it's not absolute, and it's measured by the nature of the circumstances, not by the lapse of time. And so our conversation, I think, if I were to really simplify it, really came down to when we're talking about what an imminent threat is here, right? Is it literally this moment, like this moment, somebody is climbing over the fence, right? Or is it, I see somebody who was starting to run across the lawn, who was then going to, it looks like, run over the fence. Right. And my understanding, and again, Brandon, I'm going to ask you to flesh this out, and Dennis, you as well, there were a lot of hypotheticals given during our conversation, right? Everything from a child is running into traffic, we sit on a busy road, that is imminent, right? We also heard things like, well, what if the child just runs into a field, right? And, is there real risk in running into a field? So what the conversation, for better or worse, right, it comes down to is there's 10,000 situations that we can all hypothesize about. We all tend to go to sort of the easy ones, right? Which is, oh, someone's setting a fire, the match is lit in their hand, right? Or no, they're just drinking Slurpees at 7-Eleven, right? And so I think that when we talked about eminence, it was a really good conversation, which showed humans, especially professionally trained humans, have a different perspective on what rises to a level of imminent harm, right? Is it 10 minutes from now? Does 10 minutes matter? Does 7 hours matter, right? And so we end up in these, what I always think about, these law school hypotheticals, right? Where we could talk about this for days and try to draw these fine lines, which we're never going to be able to draw. And so rather than, I guess, getting bogged down into the 10,000 hypothetical risk, right? The rabbit hole. The real question is, does the question, or the notion of eminent, does it give enough description, enough definition to all those who must abide by the definition, right? And how do you do that? So that was, I'd say, the discussion around that. And Brandon educated me quite a bit, just from a clinician standpoint. At noon, we're seeing things escalate. We're seeing things are heating up with an individual child, right? We already know they've run in the past, for example, but we do, there's, I'm sorry, I'm so stumbling over these gray lines, but there is sort of a difference of opinion in the field. Whether, oh, wait, we have to wait for this thing to happen versus, I see it coming. Like in 45 minutes to an hour, this is going to escalate. Is that imminent? So case law, I think, provides some context for both positions as being reasonable positions. And therein is the discussion, Trace, and I hope I didn't muddle it more than it's already muddled.
Not at all. Brandon, did you want to jump in with any?
Yeah, I mean, I think she described it well. I think it is complex and it's hard. But I do think that right now the lens of imminent often comes through the action of the person in crisis, rather than also including, the person responsible for keeping that person safe as well. Which, like oftentimes I wonder, like, if I have a kid that runs and they're heading towards the field, but I know this kid is, by all the evidence, likely to hurt themselves. All right. As a professional, is it the last minute I can potentially intervene is the imminency? Or is it, do I got to let them run through the field, lose them, and then I know what's happening because of the action itself? They have not created the opportunity for themselves to hurt themselves yet, which is, a lot of times, what the first, the running is to create the opportunity for them to do what they're going to do in that state of mind. And so, I think when you put it as it has to be when the action is about to happen, oftentimes you take the need for the professional away. Like, I mean, because a lot of our individuals, especially when you're talking about running, a lot of professionals cannot ensure that they're going to be with that kid until that minute happens, because they're actively trying to get away from that professional. I
Thanks,
don't know if that
Brandon.
makes sense.
Yeah, and Dennis, I wanted to make sure you had a chance too to jump in as far as like where this conversation around imminent. I know Stephanie was saying. I just wanted to make sure you didn't have anything to add before we open it up.
No, I mean, from like from our perspective, imminent means now, right? So the word imminent has a definition. That's pretty much what our take is on the word imminent.
Kevin,
It doesn't mean possibly 20 minutes later, right?
Well, two points. The first one is, I think Stephanie just told us that in law, imminent doesn't necessarily mean that. So that adds a point of non-clarity, because I would have thought, just like Dennis did, the word imminent means, going to happen real soon. But if the law kind of opens it up by case law, that's a different story. The other point I think I just wanted to get in the conversation I haven't heard yet is, in every facility, and again, I was involved with a total of 13 of them, one way or the other. Every facility, every treatment plan, there was a plan for what you can do to take space. And the child and the parents and everybody else had a vote in that treatment plan of what you can do to take space. And never was it okay to leave the facility or go outside the care of the facility. And so to me, that, I'm back to the emergency, but to me, that's alone outside the treatment plan, and that we shouldn't let someone go outside the care of the facility to take space any more than we should allow them, because they're dysregulated, to beat somebody up. They can't do that either. I mean, that's an extreme example, obviously. So I guess I just wanted to let everyone know that in my experience, there always is a treatment plan that makes accommodation for what you do if you're dysregulated.
Anybody else want to jump in here? I want to make sure we're Lynette, I see your kind of comments. Do you want to jump in and share any?
Yeah, because the word imminent is a little, I mean, they all kind of mean the same thing. But if we want to keep the language unique across settings, child welfare, when we screen referrals, and volume 7 includes that we're looking for present or impending danger. Present means it's happening right now. Impending means it's going to happen very soon, like the next hour, the next 2 hours, very quickly, for assigning response times. And I wonder if using the word danger is a better descriptor of what we're looking at. To me, there's a difference between the possibility of harm and the presence of danger, where moderate to severe harm is likely to occur. Just a thought.
Dennis, go ahead, just jump in.
I think we should be cautious about interpretation too, because this administration has about 2.5 years left, and then they leave, because there's CDHS is in the executive branch, right? The governor is term limited. He's going to leave. So if the recommendation from this group is we're going to look at the interpretation the department has on imminent, the risk is that could change. That could change from administration to administration.
Hmm.
Can I just ask a follow-up, Dennis, to that? Because I think it's an interesting point, but would that administrative perception changeover be motivation to solidify something in statute, or is that motivation to, I guess I just want to make sure I'm correlating that to the correct point you're making.
So from my perspective, let's say CDHS decides to change its interpretation of imminent, and it's what some folks on this in this group want, and they like it. There's a very real risk that interpretation could go back to what it currently is when the next administration comes in, right? So and if you're going to rely on just an interpretation of the word imminent, I think there's a very significant risk possibly that you're not going to get what you want.
And if we were to create more definition in statute, would that mitigate that concern that CDHS?
I think it would,
okay.
Right? I mean, I think you would have a better success possibly.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for letting me follow up.
Anything else here? I'm looking at our time, and I know that we've got quite a few points captured here. Jordan, I'm also looking at you if you feel okay. All right, I'm gonna move us on. So our third point really that the group was kind of wrestling around, if you will, is the duty to intervene. So by facilities acting on behalf of youth in their care and custody is not included. So state law should consider the concept here would be state law should consider the legal obligation of a provider to intervene on behalf of a patient when there is a potential for harm. In some instances, the law supports that there is no need to wait for a harm to occur before intervening on behalf of a patient. So Stephanie, want to bring you in to kind of what does this mean? What are we trying to get at here?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the group identified, and I think correctly so, is that the notion of a facility or a provider having a duty to intervene on behalf of a patient is absent in the statute. And in case law, it's pretty clear that there is a special relationship that exists between providers and patients. And particularly in light of the type of facility that we're talking about. So the case law, at least that I read briefly, talked about behavioral health facilities, the type of patients they receive, and the type of care those patients receive. And so there was this notion of what they referred to as a special relationship, and that it does impose affirmative duties of care. Not just sort of neutral duties. Like if somebody is entrusting you with their health and well-being, right? You have an obligation to secure that. And so that's really what I believe that goes to. And again, the examples that at least I was able to explore were they talked about special custodial relationships exist in jails, hospitals, schools, and others having physical control over another individual. So that is sort of the crux of it is if you look at existing statute, it omits that important duty. And if that is the case, then if we have quote hands-off policies, right, where people are like, we will never touch a child or that is not our policy, well, that's not correct either in light of case law, and statute omits that discussion or even that recognition. So that was where this came up. And again, Brandon, I'll defer to you because you were the one who got me started on this research rabbit hole.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where, I think you have a lot of organizations that, you know, are really screening hard in this area of, whether they should serve certain kids, that kind of stuff, because, I think, there's more consequences than just, regulatory consequences when you're running an organization. And nowadays that a lot of times there are even more significant than regulatory consequences. And I think that's where, the unattainable expectation that organizations are under because of that is, problematic. And I think it's also what's, strangling the organ, like the service. So I think we have, problems with, placements of kids. We have problems with, getting the services needed for kids because you just don't have people willing to take on the risk because of, not taking into that consideration into rules and regs.
So Brandon, like if I could turn that then into the question of like I'm hearing the thing you're kind of wrestling with, but like what would you like to see here from and then I would love to just hear people's reactions to that. So more specifically, yeah.
Well, I think the whole goal is to provide more clarity. That's what I'd like to say, more specificity so that we can, rely on, the clarity to, protect organizations, protect kids, whatever, direction we go. It can't be I I would want more clarity because oftentimes, um, you're held under the standard that is not what DHS wants us, or this entity wants us, and and you're trying to explain it, but even within this discussion, we have interpretative differences. Imagine getting outside of our field. I mean, a lot of it is we're involved in this specific field. As an organization, we deal with multiple entities in the community, agencies like OSHA, and different things that have complete and other different perspectives that are putting pressure on this very topic. How far is our obligation to intervene when a kid is in crisis and is doing something? What is our obligation?
Yeah, and I'm also hearing I appreciate that, and thanks for letting me just kind of push you on. I just want to be clear on what you're wanting there, and I think I'm hearing you too, that this isn't just a regulatory challenge. This is also like questions that you ask around like the facilities wanting to care for certain kids because of, you didn't use the word liability, but I'm like kind of drawing out this, like, this is challenging for us, right? And so do we want to step into this? Because then, yeah, you could see all these different issues. Anybody's like you see it differently? You want to add something? You want to share a different perspective, or kind of say, yeah, like from Brandon, what Brandon's sharing here and what Stephanie's sharing? Just want to make sure. Stephanie, yeah, go.
Yeah, I think I also just want to draw one other distinction, which is, at least from my reading of case law, there's not only an affirmative duty for a provider or facility to act, that duty might even be heightened, if you will, because of the nature of care that is being provided. And so I think that adds a different layer of obligation for us to think on this hard. And the other piece of this is, it's not just from the facility's obligations to provide care. The other notion is, if the person who goes into care has an expectation that you understand their conditions and that your job is to keep them safe until they can get treatment or help. And so I think that's an important thing as well. It's not just a provider perspective. If I have this duty, it's also the patient has an expectation legally that when I contract with you to take care of me, when money exchanges hands and contracts are signed, I have the right to enforce that. And that is where the legal obligation on all sides begins to occur. So I always worry that these conversations sound like they're strictly from a provider perspective, but in fact, it's also the right of patients to expect certain levels of care.
Thanks, Stephanie. Kevin, you want to jump in there, and then
Yeah, just a
on
question
here.
for Stephanie, since she's done some research on this. In this case, we're dealing with minors, and minors are under the care of their parents. What right do parents have? Because I keep hearing, well, kids have rights. My question is, do parents also, inherently have rights because of the role they play in the child's life?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, parents absolutely do have rights. They're pretty broad. They're constitutional in nature, primarily, and they're broad, right? It's the right to be able to raise your child, for example, free of government interference, right? There are these big, broad concepts that eventually sort of trickle down to everyday parenting practices. So the answer is, parents do have rights, and those things, when you turn over those rights at some level, right? Not like custodial rights, but you're in essence entrusting another party with the care of your child, right? That's where things get a little bit tricky. This notion that kids have rights is a broad statement that always causes me concern. And it would require literally a 3-hour conversation. Every time I hear that statement, I'm like, yes, and it's really complicated. What we do have of a lot of laws that protect children and youth, that's very different than saying a parent has a constitutional right to raise their kids. And I could get into international law discussions with you, which would make you cry and bore you to tears. But the truth is, the United States is one of the few countries in the world who does not give children rights per se. And that's by international law, and it's complicated. So I just caution when we use that narrative for us to just remember that as a narrative and not based on law or facts completely. It's very nuanced.
Right, I've heard it on the news. I heard that used in the news over time,
I
3
do
or 4
too.
times. Oh, kids have rights, and that's why we couldn't do this or that or
I
this.
hear it too. It's not as clean as that. And yes, there are many protections for children, absolutely. But it's deeper than that.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that question, Brandon. And then I want to kind of keep us moving here. Got 2 more.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm a big believer in the clinical practice of informed consent. I mean, I think a lot of this, comes down to how much weight does informed consent have, if you are informing, because I think this answers Kevin's, question as well. Like if you're informing of, people of what you do and you are transparent about it, and they're, both the patient and the parents, are aware of it and they want that and that's what they're looking for, that should carry a lot more weight in these type of, gray areas. And I don't think that necessarily does, and I think that could be a big part of this, uh, I guess, gray area or interpretation is like, this is what we do in runaway situations, and here's exactly what happens, and here are the steps, and blah, blah, blah. And if that's informed and that's what the parent and the patient wants, I mean, I think, those protections, I think that's important to weigh that into these discussions.
Thanks, Brandon, capturing that. Anybody else want to weigh in here or before I'm going to move us on? Looking at time. Okay. All right. So moving on to the kind of 4th headline here from the prevention group. This is something that has come up in each of these discussions. So again, a lot of overlap here, but I think just to kind of hone in specifically around this particular point of a good faith requirement. So, good faith requirement could be considered in statute when reviewing whether a facility properly administered a restraint is kind of the point folks are wrestling with. Currently, there's nothing in law that gives facilities guidance on what information may be relied upon to justify a restraint. Stephanie, what would you add as far as context for the group as what we're really wrestling with here and what we're trying to get at?
Yeah, the notion behind this, I think, was more about facility protections against regulatory violations. It was my interpretation of the conversation. And so, in other words, that there would be a good faith requirement, right? That a facility would have to show a regulator, hey, I acted in good faith. Let me show you the case file. Let me show you the prior attempts. Let me show you all the things that went in before I get a negative licensing violation. I want there to be something that protects me, that gives me the opportunity, and all of us, to have a conversation about the multitude of factors that went into a particular action, in this case, to restrain a child. That was my understanding of it. I say that because we never quite got to the and what a good faith requirement protects me how. But that my interpretation was it was about sort of regulatory action. And again, I would defer to my facility friends on that.
Yeah, Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I do think that the uncertainty around consequences for both the professional and organizations, sorry, organizations are is important, and it's important to address it in the industry. I mean, more than anything, you want people to feel accountable, but you want people to feel safe up and down. That parallel process is critical to treatment communities and what we do. And when you have, professionals that are uncertain and are in fear of, consequences of, doing things that they feel are right, it can create, more risk and more danger for individuals that are in our care. And I think it's important that due process and those things are addressed through these, good faith. I like that title, the good faith, but I look at it as a lot like prudent parenting, and we've done it in other aspects of our industry. The Prudent Parenting Act. I mean, what would you do, uh with your own kid? Like, if you're doing something, that it protects you, I think that needs to extend in a lot of cases to these situations.
All right, let's thanks Brandon for those points. And I think what might be helpful is let's think about this conversation in 2 points. One, as it relates to like a good faith requirement or this kind of spelled out, obviously you're hearing from facility perspective of like this the strengths of that and what that would be like helping. So anything to add there, like what you like about this, what you want to see in this. And then the second half of this conversation would be what concerns or questions or like points of clarification do you have as it relates to any sort of language or any sort of potential recommendation as we're drafting. So let's start with the like, what do you like? What does this stand out for you? Lynette, yeah, I'm gonna pick on you. You said it's a good point. Did you have an aha there with Brandon's point, or
The prudent parent rules and standard. Using that that lens to create recommendations. And those are things that have to be approved by the treatment plan, by the county and the guardian ad litem when it's a prudent parent issue. But using that same framework for facilities, I think it guarantees that everybody has a say in what's going to happen and what the plan is and what's going to be okay for a specific youth based on their needs, as opposed to a different kid with different issues. I just thought that makes sense.
thanks, Lynette. Anybody else want to jump in on what makes sense about this to you, what you like, and then we'll get into the questions or concerns you may have, or what you'd want to see on any sort of good faith requirements.
I think the other thing that we had briefly talked about was that the good faith gives the opportunity to allow professionals to make the professional decision, right? So it was kind of protecting from that liability, but also saying like, you guys are trained. This is your facility that you're working in. You're trained in these pieces. So I think that was a part of it. I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Jenna. And yeah, Becky, I actually want to come over to you. I'm kind of curious in your conversations on the provider side. Like, I saw a head nod, but I'm curious, like, does that track? Is this something that's like people would be like, yes, oh my gosh, thank you.
Hugely, yeah. What Jenna just said was huge. I think that respect for the professional discretion is really, really important to providers because they are heavily trained and held accountable very heavily. So yeah, what Jenna just said makes great sense.
All right, let's flip this. I want to invite in, what does this bring up for you? Questions, or what are points that you, or concerns, or what are points that you would want to ensure that we're keeping in mind as any sort of recommendation would be shaped up from this conversation?
Okay, sorry, I'll speak again. I think on the flip side of that, where we have to be careful is, unfortunately, there's, sometimes we have bad actors out there and they'll say they were acting in good faith and they're not. So I think the other piece that there has to be, I think maybe you had said, Trace, but very clear documentation for them to be able to say, this is why I felt that it was escalating to this point to be able to put hands on. So I think that, which again, I think all facilities know, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. So just being able to show that clear documentation, I think that has to be part of it.
So any sort of clarity that there would be, the good faith is not just like a your word is your bond, but what are additional ways that there's accountability in that, if that is a factor? Yep. Anybody else? All right. I'm going to round us out with this facility hands-off policies piece. So there's currently nothing in state law that requires a facility to notify a parent or custodian of this type of policy. So we heard, and this is coming from this had come up before, but one of the providers on the panel was like, we have a hands-off policy, to which the point was like, well, does a parent know that? And does a placement provider know that? Like, what does that bring up? So the whole point here was parents need to know what a facility policy is to make sure they are acting in the best interest of their child. So what is Stephanie, I'll throw it to you. What nuances here were present as far as the group? That's my recollection of where this conversation really came from, and it kind of was illuminated in that panel discussion of like someone saying we actually have this policy, and it's kind of like, well, that's a one-off facility policy. So like, what are the right, kind of going back, Kevin, to your question of like the rights of the parent piece. But yeah, Stephanie, what would you add here?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would, again, I defer to my friend Elizabeth here, who raised a parent's ability to understand what are these policies and to be informed in a way they can make the best decisions for their own children. And Elizabeth, I'd ask you to chime in because this was a point that you really drove home during our session.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, I remember in Timmy's last intake being told that, for instance, that they didn't use a locked door quiet room like the previous facility. But I bring up that a parent who's been in crisis with their kiddo for months and months and months on end, we're like living in our lizard brain, right? So what you're saying to us, as general policy may not interpret when I bring my kiddo to you and you know that running away is his primary risky behavior at that point, you need to give me a scenario base, like when he runs from my facility, this is what we're going to do or not do. You need to really spell it out for us, because sometimes we're just not at the point where we can receive all the jargon that's just printed on the paper, right? So it needs to be very clear.
So Elizabeth, kind of what you're saying is a requirement that there is transparency from the facility on any internal policies they have as it relates to all these other pieces we're discussing, as it relates to like scenarios, I think is the word used.
Right.
Okay. Questions or comments from folks around this kind of notion of sort of recommendation around clarity as it relates to parents understanding an agency in this sort of situation? Obviously, this is some could see this as a narrow piece, but it's a very specific kind of recommendation ask here. Any thoughts? Jenna, go ahead.
Is it required to have safety plans in place, specifically safety run plans? So kids like Timmy, is there a requirement to have? And if not, would that be something? Because then if there's always team meetings. So if there's a team meeting that comes up with a very specific run plan, that's then given to the parents. The child knows the plan and the staff know the plan. So they know kind of what's expected if that child were to run, potentially.
Yeah, curious. Brandon, could you jump in with that?
About what they're particularly talking about, like, or the situation, I guess.
Sorry, is it required in facilities? I don't know, to have a safety plan or maybe not, or a run plan, you have to have a safety plan for every child. So if a child comes to you and their main behavior is running, does a safety plan have to be implemented? And if not, is that something we would want to recommend? I don't know. I just thought I would throw that out there. Yeah. To Elizabeth's point, then the team creates it, the parents have say in it, the child's aware of it. That also takes into the child, they're knowledgeable of what will happen if you try and run out of this facility.
Yeah. I don't know if there's an actual requirement. We do put safety plans in all our kids. But I don't know if there's an actual requirement to do it. So I'm unsure about that. I do think that when we're talking about this, and I've dealt with this before because, you know, I don't think it's as much about the facilities that don't ever go hands-on in situations. I think it's more actually the expectations of people that when they send their kid to a place that does, physically intervene, but then in the runaway situation they don't, and not being clear on that part of it. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes about, because they're expecting their kid to be stopped, and then they find out, like I think Kevin alluded to, like they get a call and that their kid's gone and gone for a couple hours. And I think that's where a lot of that conflict could potentially come from. And I don't think it's clear on that, because we inform everybody that we use physical intervention in emergency situations and safety, but we've only recently started clarifying that aspect of the runaway situation.
I'm remembering Dennis's point too around the statute, like just as it relates to safety plans around the statute, that physical restraint cannot be part of the safety plan, I believe is what. So just as a reminder there, as well as it relates to like how this would interact with the safety plan versus like a facility policy.
Well, I think there's a big again interpretation of what's a prescription. It can't be prescribed. The restraint can't be prescribed. The question becomes, what are the, can you put in, and actually I'm in discussion with our licensing monitor about that actually right now. Can you put tools that would be utilized in these situations versus prescription? And she's looking into that, but like there's still, clarity issues around that as well.
Thanks, Brandon. Kevin, and then Elizabeth, I saw your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to still jump in, and then I think we're ready to wrap this portion. We'll take a quick break. So Kevin, go ahead.
Just real quick, just a real life example that might be instructive to somebody, I'm not sure. My child was placed, among the various facilities he's in. He was placed at Ridgeview Academy 4 times, and they always had a form, for the parent, regardless of whether the court placed him there or not, saying, are you willing to allow us to physically restrain him if he does certain things, including running behavior? And I always gladly signed that form, as did my son. So he understood. The 4th time he was placed there, Ridgeview was the only facility that would accept him. No one else, including Brandon's facility, would accept him. And I was told by the facility, although there was no form, we no longer, the interpretation of state law is such that we no longer, although we're trained, can put hands on him. I immediately described concerns to them that, his history is he runs, his history is becomes dysregulated and can get aggressive. They had successfully stopped him from getting aggressive or running 2 or 3 times over the years in his various trips. And of course, that's exactly what happened. He was able to walk away and they weren't allowed to touch him. And, some really bad stuff happened after that I won't go into anymore. So that's a real life example. The same facility, whenever policy changed, they no longer could use the tool that they'd used successfully multiple times with him prior.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I appreciate your willingness to share your example. Anything else here as far as I think I'm pretty clear on feedback I've heard from folks around this piece, and particularly from the parent perspective on the committee around what you'd like to see. So any other comments before we take a break? Okay. Well, let's take a break. Really appreciate the discussion. Again, this is a really heady, meaty, personal, sensitive, topic. And so just really appreciate y'all's presence and willingness to lean in. Let's take a break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to pivot to the intervention group with Doris. And then so we'll go on break until 9:50, and then we'll come back. So that gives us 15 minutes. We'll see you back at 9:50. Thanks, y'all. We love a welcome back. Doris, just trying to tee you up. We'll give everybody just a little bit longer to come back on video if you're able to. See some folks coming back in. All right, cool. Doris, gonna hand it off to you to talk all things intervention.
Awesome, thank you. So over the 2 prior meetings, our subcommittee focused on temporary placements. And I'll provide a little bit of a recap of our conversation and sort of where we landed in summative form. And then open the floor up for a discussion on, just sort of reflections, any gaps that are missing, any things that cause you pause or raise concerns. But just to sort of level set on where we were and where we've been. So similar to the prevention subcommittee, we had these discussions over 2 conversations. So I'm going to share screen. I also put together a little bit of a PowerPoint just to guide our conversation. I'll put the link in the chat as well. I don't remember who owns the invite. But we'll stop other participants. Never mind. I got a little prompt and I was like confused for a second. So when I said I was going to put the prompt in or the link in the chat. My apologies in advance. I am struggling with something going on with my sinuses. It seems to be a virus, but it's not COVID. I did take a COVID test this morning just to make sure. All right, so just to recap really quick, our directive is focused on or includes looking at placement facility protocols and evaluating and treating children who have run away. And this particular focus around temporary placement is something that bubbled up in prior conversations. And so we dug a little bit deeper into one, just assessing the level of interest in establishing some specific task force recommendations around temporary placement for youth who run from out-of-home care, surveying the intervention subcommittee, and overwhelmingly, yes, there was an interest in developing some recommendations specific to temporary placements. So we dove in a little bit deeper using these 2 questions as prompts. So one, really trying to get at what might be the goal or set of goals for temporary placement so that we can really focus our discussion on like what are we trying to accomplish and or solve for with the use of these temporary placements. And then digging into what are some of the elements that we would want or that the subcommittee and ultimately the task force might be interested in including in any policy considerations or specifics, policy recommendations for implementing temporary placements for youth who run from care. So we started with, just to provide a little bit of background and level set, we started with, as a subcommittee, really starting to grapple with these 2 questions in our first meeting. And in the second meeting, we, similar to the prevention subcommittee, had a little bit of a panel conversation to dig into the prior use of emergency sheltering or temporary kinds of placements, just to get some lessons learned on what they have looked like, how they're being implemented, what are the, some of the responses to kids who have run from care, and when they are located, there's not a long-term permanent placement that's sort of lined up for them. And so, really just to get some insights on what are some of the prior and current practices to meet the needs of these kids. And then use that as, again, a jumping off point to go a little bit deeper around what would we want to include, again, in recommendations around temporary placements for youth who run from care. So I want to just walk through some of the discussion that we had as a subcommittee. And I'm going to pause for each of the commentary that we have around the two main questions, really just to get some broader task force insights and input on where the subcommittee landed. So in our conversation around the goals for temporary placement, the subcommittee identified these 5 goals. The first is to provide a safe place for youth after they have been located. And there's this note here around really thinking about this population and sort of bringing in some of the concerns and questions, considerations around wanting to make sure that there can be a real focus attention on these youth, and also in recognition for concerns around mixing these youth in milieus with more diverse populations or larger group of population that could result in potentially more youth from that placement running away. So there was just a note here about trying to think about the ratio of staff to youth, and just the number of youth, particularly with the history of running away being placed in the same facility. There was a desire, and you'll see this one come back again when we talk about some of the elements to include in a policy recommendation around ensuring that the temporary placements have a process for assessing the youth for any trauma and harm while they were on the run. So in our prior conversation around prevention, there was acknowledgement for some of the risks associated with youth being on the street. And, when they are located, really having an opportunity to gather from the youth what might have happened while they were on a run, and assess for any trauma or harm that occurred while they were on the run. This need for ensuring that there was an assessment for any underlying root causes for the run, and an effort to identify what might be the appropriate longer term placement or services for that youth. So really this desire to ensure that these temporary placements weren't just holding places, that there was some meaningful interaction with the youth that also could serve as part of prevention planning from future runs. So using this opportunity to start to surface what might have caused the run, and again, importantly, to work toward providing a longer term placement for the young person, because again, these are temporary placements for youth and not intended to be long-term placements. And then these last two, ensuring that the facility is staff secure. And in our second conversation, we dove a little bit more deeply into the staff secure kind of conversation. Again, trying to distinguish that from physical restraints, but using staffing ratios to mitigate the risk of youth from running in the future. So then we dove into, let me pause there and just see if anyone has anything to add from our subcommittee, and also to just check to see if, if others on the task force have any additional goals that they would want to see reflected in the goals for temporary placements. I am going to stop share briefly, just so that I could see everyone's lovely face, and checking for any questions or additions, conversation around the goals for temporary placement option. Beth?
Yeah, I think the only other thing, just like reiterating, is like this was not meant who is located that's been on the run. It's more those identified high risk youth, or those that are like chronically running from that facility.
Thank you, Beth. Any other points of clarification or commentary from the subcommittee? Dennis, I know that you sort of split your time over those two meetings. You joined the first conversation around temporary placements, and then for the last task force meeting, you joined the prevention. So any thing that you, or again others want to add from the conversation that we had, which for some or many of you may seem like it was 8 years ago.
Well,
Dennis?
my only thought around this is this type of facility would not be financially viable. It wouldn't nobody would come to the table to create this for us because it wouldn't be viable financially.
Can you say more about that?
So, okay, so providers get a daily rate from counties when they place a kid, right? But in order for this type of program to be successful, it has to have empty beds because you need a bed for the kid when he's on the run or when he's found or she's found, right? So that you need to have empty beds. A provider is not paid for empty beds. So therefore, it would be very difficult to be financially stable operating this type of facility.
Thank you, Dennis. Brandon? I'm gonna come back to that that point you made, Dennis, because we had some additional conversation around licensing and funding and things like that. Brandon?
Yeah, I guess my biggest concern would be the operational, nature of a facility like this. You're bringing, kids that, all the kids will be there that, are kids that are running, and you're trying to prevent that from happening again. I think it would be a very challenging situation, even with a 1-to-1 ratio, 2-to-1 ratios of, these kids, a lot of them will have the intention and desire to run again. And I think it'll be a very challenging situation to be in, for just to be a staff secured.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that particular goal presents some specific challenges around, being able to like adequately maintain staffing.
Yeah, I think you could do it with a secure facility, but yeah, I think it would be very difficult with the staff secured.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts, ideas, reactions to this set of goals for a temporary placement? Recommendations around temporary placement for youth who run away? All right, so I want to then move on to the some of the meat around other considerations for these temporary placement options. So after sort of like having this conversation around what might the goals be, we started talking about the kinds of youth and situations that might be appropriate for a temporary placement option once the youth has been located after running away, and came up with this list of 7 criteria. One of them being that the youth was not making progress in a prior placement, and also might be one of the factors that make that prior placement not an option, in addition to the situations where no other placement option for the youth has been located. So we know that in some of the instances where youth run from care, they lose their bed. So when they are located, then the placement that they were at prior is no longer an option because they don't have the space for that youth any longer. In addition to those situations where the prior placement just seems like it might not be suitable because the youth was not making progress with their treatment plan. Instances where the runaway behavior is chronic, instances where the youth has disclosed safety concerns at the prior placement, again, making that prior placement not a suitable option. And then we had some conversation around, those youth who have been trafficked, and recognizing that there is a unique set of circumstances around that youth that might make just returning them to the prior placement, even if there was a bed remaining in that facility, that might not be suitable at that moment in time. And then lastly, we had some conversation, which really isn't about the criteria for temporary placement, but really this interest in taking a multidisciplinary approach and using kind of a team-based approach to both understand what the needs are of the youth, from those different perspectives so that there's more of a holistic understanding of the youth, the circumstances under which they ran, and also using that group to then plan for what might be not only the temporary placement option, but a longer term placement option. I want to pause there again, just to invite the committee members in to both check me on the notes and also just to round out, add to, or amend any of the criteria that we discussed in our conversation. I'm going to stop sharing again really quick. Anything that the subcommittee didn't think about as we think about the young people that might be suitable for a temporary placement? Oh, a real chatty. Elizabeth, thank you so much for breaking the silence.
Well, it just occurred to me, as I was listening that, you know, this wasn't specifically for running away, but Timmy's Medicaid waiver allowed for temporary placement in, you know, like a foster situation or respite situation, something like that. But our issue was there were no providers in our area. To Dennis's point, I mean, nobody, it's just too expensive for people to keep beds open, I guess. So.
Yeah, thank you for that, Elizabeth. I think echoing Dennis's comment around the trying to be realistic and putting forth recommendations that you know, actually could gain some traction and you know, having providers available to provide this kind of service is really important. Kevin, did you mean to share screen?
Yeah, I have I just had a quick question for Dennis. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. We're looking
Right, I
at
just messed up my screen, but that's my problem.
Okay, no problem.
My question for Dennis is, I mean, I'm only familiar with a couple of facilities, the qualifying house being one of them, but they always have a minimum limit that the state pays them for, regardless whether the beds are filled or not. In other words, I know that facility has a minimum limit of 7 that they get paid for, even if the number temporarily drops to 4. Isn't that the case generally, or is that just certain facilities that have that kind of arrangement?
The Q House has a contract with Division of Youth Services that pays for those beds. Other facilities don't have that arrangement. They only get paid when a county places the kid.
Okay.
Dennis, can you clarify that a little further? Because like Laredon has, and I know Southern Peaks has a contract. Like what does it take to get beds paid for?
Well, CDHS would have to have a budget for it.
No.
Right. And then we would, like 18254 created the funding source for Laredon, right? And then the high acuity bill that just passed 1038 gave us funding for QRTP beds and like to preserve our contracted PRTF beds. But without that funding source, we don't have the ability to just contract with a provider and say, give us 10 beds for this temporary placement type of thing, right?
So like the respite beds we have with Shiloh and Kids Crossing, that's also paid for in a separate pot?
Yeah, but I don't think we have, I don't know that we're gonna have the funding for that going forward. I'll have to check. But yeah, it's generally some legislation that created funding for CDHS to be able to contract for those beds.
Got it. Thank you.
We also have some CPA contracted beds too.
I missed that last point that you made, Dennis. Can you restate that?
About how we get funded to pay for beds.
Yeah.
Okay, so Originally, the Laridan project came about because there just wasn't placements in Colorado for very difficult IDD youth. And so what we determined was providers weren't able to resource themselves appropriately to serve those very difficult youth. So what we decided to do was, and then if they have open beds too, they can't really budget for it. So we decided to just pay them for all of their beds at a rate that would allow them to staff up to what they needed to be staffed for. And then we just pay for the bed whether there's a youth in the bed or not. And then Laridan knows what their budget is, and they're able to staff accordingly to serve those youth. Same principle as what we're doing with Southern Peaks.
And are you saying that that's not a viable option for something like this temporary placement?
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying CDHS doesn't just have funds available to
I got you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other, sorry, Jordan, go ahead.
I just want to, so the current funding legislation doesn't exist in us, but this, I just want to make sure I'm capturing the notes correctly. This could be a potential option if we seek to move forward to make some kind of recommendation for legislation with attached funding. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that this could be a potential model the task force considers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good statement.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification, Jordan, too. And I thought that, again, it feels like it was maybe 8 years ago when we had that first conversation. I thought, Dennis, that you had, sort of shared that approach and as a potential model for moving something like this forward. But again, the recommendation I think would have to also include the funding appropriate to be able to contract with providers for this kind of a service.
Yeah, definitely. Because you need empty beds for it to be successful. It has to have space available, and so somebody has to pay for that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and we did talk about that, there'd have to be a mechanism for being able to fund actually setting aside these beds for these youth, recognizing that there are going to be times where those beds are empty.
And you would need you would need to probably have some kind of regional approach. Like you couldn't just have one facility in Denver.
That's right.
We probably would need something in Grand Junction, probably down south somewhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and we talked about that. I was going to get to that dot point here in a moment as the subcommittee continued to grapple with what this could look like. Stephanie?
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, first of all, subcommittee, beautiful work. There are pages and pages of your conversations, which I thought were just really interesting. So thank you. And I guess my question is, did the subcommittee explore what is our current inventory? I mean, not like we can count beds, like we're not inside facilities to count beds, but generally, how many sort of options did the group think about might be available? I saw a reference to kinship placements. I saw a reference to Urban Peak. So I was just curious about that inventory and where the committee came out on that first. My second question is, when I did see Urban Peak, and I think I brought this up before, I know that there are federal laws that prohibit kids being sheltered for certain periods of time, and I just wanted to know if that was discussed and how that relates to this issue.
Yeah, I'd love to have other committee members chime in on the question of the inventory. I will say that we didn't sort of do a complete mapping of what all exists out there for that sort of are similar to temporary placements. In the second meeting that we had, we did have some conversation around the ways in which some counties are approaching this kind of situation and sort of the cobbled together mechanisms that they use in order to find a a right now placement, sort of, while efforts can then be made for the long-term strategy. And we'll walk through that a little bit more here in a moment, but there's not like a kind of like a statewide approach for, you know, you find a youth and you need something temporary to do sort of an assessment of like what might be the best long-term placement, or you just don't have another placement. And so again, it is, you know, my words, not theirs, but sort of this cobbled together in real time approach to address the immediacy of placement needs for the youth that's in front of you. Beth, I want to come to you, and then I'll come to you, Dennis.
Yeah, I know that in regards to kinship placing, we did talk a little bit about that. But seeing some of those placements also being harmful and just like where it's like last resort, okay, this is going to strictly be temporary, and then it turns into months on end in a not necessarily safe and supportive environment. And also looking at, you know, part of building out this temporary placement is having that clinical support built in, as opposed to just here's a safe adult. And then also in regards to foster home placements, oftentimes when a youth is labeled as a chronic runaway, they're refusing to take those because they're identified as too high of risk.
Yeah, thank you for that, Beth. Dennis?
As far as runaway and homeless youth shelters like Urban Peak, child welfare children and youth cannot be served in those types of facilities. Their federal funding does not allow for it.
Thank you for that, Dennis. And we did have some conversation in our subcommittee about that barrier, and then sort of thinking about you know, what could be appropriate for youth in foster care, so child welfare youth, in this scenario where, you know, the youth is run from care and we're trying to find a suitable temporary location that that meets both their clinical needs and provides for a placement option.
Can I just ask a follow-up question on that, Doris?
Yep.
Yeah, I think federal law might be more complicated than that, because I do know that, and again, somebody help me, maybe it's Beth. I need my lifeline. I know that there is something about restrictions on sheltering youth, child welfare youth. I also know there is a praxis that they do it. And I know it's got timeframes like 31 days if you're under 18. I don't know, but there's more to that, and I just want to grab onto that because that nuance matters.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anyone who can help me with that?
It's 21 days at Urban Peak. Same with, what is it, the Empowerment Center. So many like shelters is 21 days. I know that they've, you know, with our partnerships, they sometimes get creative where it's like 21 days at Urban Peak and then 21 days at Together or the Source in Boulder. And I will say, you know, talking with Urban Peak is that it's rare circumstances. It's not an official MOU or MOA type of situation, but where it's, okay, we don't have anywhere and the youth is saying that they will agree to stay at Urban Peak, and it's at max like 2 days.
So Beth, is that not being funded then by federal dollars? Like that's where I'm still not clear about what's happening or how they're allowed to do that for 31 days. Is that private funding then they're putting it? Like somebody help me with this.
Well, I used to run runaway and homeless youth shelter, so they get what's called a basic center grant from the federal government, and that basic center grant lays out certain conditions, and then you're absolutely doing a ton of fundraising to like for private donations and to fund the facility.
And then Dennis, is that a facility that had runaway youth who were child welfare involved, or is that just runaway youth, non-child welfare involved?
Well, so Urban Peak is only a runaway and homeless youth shelter. The facility I was operating was also an RCCF though, so we had both populations.
Okay, thank you.
But we couldn't serve, like we had to like when the federal government would come out to like audit our program, they would say, okay, physically show me that you have these beds available for runaway and homeless youth, that you're not
Okay,
utilizing those beds for child welfare.
thank you. Michelle?
I mean, I think I just wanted to we're dealing with this in real time, like right now. I have a youth in the foot, was kicked out of his facility immediately, given no notice. The entire state of Colorado says no to placing him. And the magistrate's like, cool, if you guys don't have a plan by Thursday, we're gonna give DHS custody. What would you like us to do? Where would you like me to put him? He can't go home. Parents are refusing to have him home. Like, this is just really, really frustrating on a lot of people's parts, but I think, I work for the department, so the caseworker is extremely stressed, and then we wonder why we have turnover, right? Like, it's a problem that I think like a lot of people have to come to the table and solve.
Thank you for that, Michelle.
To that point, the model that has the only model that we've really worked out that's been successful in this realm is when we resource the facilities to take these really difficult youth, like the one you just described. So like Southern Peaks has a small army of staff to try to manage some of those kids, but like a regular RCC or a QRTP, that it gets paid a daily rate of $320 a day. They are not able to serve those types of youth. They can't staff to the levels they need to staff to serve.
Thank you, Dennis. I know that Jordan put in the chat a question to try to get at the citation for the federal citation around prohibitions or limits on foster youth being placed in a temporary placement.
Yeah, thanks, Doris. So we have attempted to find this, and there are a number of, I just want to make sure we're all talking about the same citation and place in law, because Stephanie's point, you could bring in multiple provisions here that provide multiple different avenues. And as we write the report, I want to make sure that we're all looking at the same one or the same multiple provisions. That's we're just having a hard time narrowing in on what the authority is.
Jordan, if you reach out to Trevor Williams, he can get all that stuff for you.
And Dennis, I'm sorry, can you remind me who Trevor Williams is?
He's the youth services manager for the Division of Child Welfare.
Great. I will reach out to you for his contact.
I'll just send an email. I'll do an introduction for you too.
Right. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks. It would be helpful just to understand what the rules are.
Yeah. Awesome. So moving us along a little bit. So some of this, oh Lord. Okay, I gotta get myself together. So some of the other considerations that we talked about, some of which came up in this conversation today, this recognition that temporary placements should not be the only thing, that we know that there has to be a robust continuum of therapeutic placements for these youth. And that, there is a real challenge with foster homes and other and facilities like refusing to take these kids because of the risk that they pose. In our first conversation, Dennis, I think you brought this up, that CDHS could establish and fund a network of providers to serve runaway youth. We'd have to be really intentional in the recommendations around this. And I think importantly, including a funding request, because a mandate without funds, particularly for this kind of service, would ultimately not result in temporary placements being stood up or expanded across the state. We also had some conversation in recognition that some older youth with a history of running away have had success with independent living programs that allow them to live, and this is my word, not the group's, interdependently. So when we think about, you know, some of the older teens, the options for them, sort of really thinking creatively about ways to support their transitioning into adulthood, and sort of thinking about options in a broader way than I think we have been in talking about temporary placements. Having consistent criteria for waiting lists for these independent living options, and then establishing some expectations and parameters for length of time for temporary placements, which we'll come back to when we talk about some of the specific recommendations from the group that we talked about. And, you know, just a note here that currently the county has to submit an appeal to CDHS, which could be used for these placements for youth to stay past 21 days. I think you'll see in these subsequent recommendations, sort of like as we got into some potential policy recommendations for temporary placements, the ideal would be 21 days or less. So not looking at these as long-term stopgaps where kids are just forgotten. Also just recognizing that with workforce challenges and other cases blowing up, that it can be in some ways easy for these kids, because they're like stabilized, they're in a place to sort of get, my word again, not the group, sort of lost and remain in those places beyond 21 days if there's not real attention to, you know, sort of figuring out what are the next steps. So some other policy considerations, having these youth in a small milieu with 4 or 5 youth or less. To your earlier point, Dennis, around having these options regionally based, so that there are options across the state, looking at funding and licensing through CDHS, using rules to build out the expectations for providers who end up contracting for this particular services, contracts with providers, including with at least one provider that specializes in working with youth who have been trafficked. So not just looking at having regional options available, but also having some options that are specialized in serving youth with certain needs and experiences, including youth who have been trafficked, and ensuring continuation of care. So this idea of sort of warm handoffs, and ensuring that these temporary placements maintain continuity of medications to the extent possible, any treatment services that the youth was receiving before they ran, or therapy to sort of maintain them while they're in these temporary placements. So there isn't that, so that the kid doesn't deteriorate as a result of not receiving those services. And then, as I mentioned earlier, during our second conversation, we talked about some of the lessons learned and challenges in operationalizing temporary placements for different counties, and just some of the things that they've run into. And I should have probably used air quotes for temporary placements, because it's really like, again, catch as catch can, like sort of you have this youth that's been located, and you're really just trying to cobble together a placement and some wraparound supports in order to maintain the youth while a longer term plan is worked out. You know, some of the things that we heard from our panelists is that the placements are typically made on an emergency basis and during a crisis, that it can be difficult to find placements that are willing to accept youth for short periods, that county departments sometimes are forced to ask caseworkers to sit with the youth, which presents some concerns about liability, and how best to sort of stand in this sort of caregiver kind of gap during that crisis moment. And a particular issue was raised for youth who are on medications. Those medications are known. We have the medications on hand, but liability issues in a caseworker, for instance, or a worker in an emergency shelter kind of placement administering medications. Some facilities are reluctant to accommodate placements due to safety and liability concerns. And there was some hearkening or discussion around what used to be available pre-Family First Prevention Services Act. Douglas County prioritized kinship placements and uses community resources to kind of wrap around youth in kind of this short-term kind of way, again, to kind of solve for the immediate crisis. And, you know, as Beth noted earlier, that can present some concerns because the kinship placement might not be the appropriate placement given the clinical needs of the youth, but it may be all that is available at the time. And then someone noted, and I don't remember who provided this insight, is that the Family Resource Pavilion offers respite beds, but requires extensive documentation and sort of like thinking about what pieces and parts of existing or prior practices could inform the development of a policy or recommendations around temporary placements. Some additional lessons learned, paying parents for stays in hotels so that they could stay in those places with their child or youth. In some instances, hospitals have become a last resort for youth without safe placement. So where a youth is already in a hospital, you know, really leaving them there because a placement hasn't been identified. In Denver, so, you know, trying to, again, pull from things that have been utilized in the past or currently utilized. In Denver, there's an agreement with Urban Peak, which we've talked a little bit about, to accommodate runaway youth temporarily. But there are some limitations on capacity and duration of stay. Denver also partners
Hold
with
on,
other shelters.
let's pause on
You want
that.
to pause there?
Yeah, if that's happening, that's illegal. That can't happen. So like yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to get in touch with Denver. They can't do that. That's not
Does
something.
anyone from the group want to, is anyone here that knows more about that can share? Or test whether that was accurate in our conversation?
I'm really hoping it's not accurate.
I'm from Denver. I can say that we don't have a contract with Urban Peak at all from the DHS lens. So I don't know if we were talking about kids in custody in that discussion, or maybe kids in the community or something like that. But from kids in DHS custody, we do not place or contract or coordinate with Urban Peak.
Urban
Peak
Peaks
refuses to because they can't work with DHS with kids in custody.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Anna. So I do know that in some of our conversations, there was a mixing of the youth that we're talking about. So a combination of youth that might have been placed in a facility by their parents and ran away, kids who were in CDHS custody. And so it could have been, to your point, Anna, a conversation that was not about foster youth, but other youth who anything else from the group on that conversation? All right, actually, I think I'm on the wrong slide. So I want to move to the conversation around some of the elements that the subcommittee talked about, including in temporary placement recommendations. And this is the shorthand version, so I'll flesh out a little bit more in the conversation. So again, an interest in these placements not just being holding places, but having programming to identify and meet the clinical needs of the youth, programming to ensure there was continuity in their education, and to ensure that there was continuity of any service or treatment plans before the youth went on run status. Ensuring that there's communication and collaboration across the different disciplines and entities that both may have information on the youth and maybe working with the youth. Ensuring that there is an assessment upon intake into these placements to get at a deeper understanding of what prompted the run, what underlying root causes might exist for the youth, and also to help inform longer-term placement planning. Medication access, as I noted earlier, there was a note around concerns about medication not being continued because of specific liability concerns. And so having the ability to ensure that youth who are on medications can continue to receive their medications in these temporary placement options. To the earlier conversation around trying to ensure that that these kids do have an option. So in removing some of the disqualifiers that exist today, namely the one around having a history of running. We know that many of these youth have a history of running. And so, eliminating that as a disqualifier from being placed in these temporary placements, focusing on stabilization, safety planning, and then also permanency planning. So thinking about this as an extension of other touch points for youth as a mechanism for, again, not just having a holding pattern, but having doing some work that can inform permanency planning for the youth. Some additional considerations, bringing in concerns or considerations around the developmental stage of the youth and any intellectual or developmental disabilities or other factors related to the use to the youth, and taking a systemic approach to these youth. We had some conversation around some of the gaps that exist with respect to data and understanding the scope of the issue. And so wanting to embed some requirements on data collection and use to make sure that there is forward-facing understanding of the youth who run away, their needs, how long their runaway status, that can inform any future planning efforts to meet the needs of these youth. And then also just we had some conversation bringing back and naming the equity as a priority in the response to these youth. So ensuring that any of these temporary placements are designed such that there are options that meet the culturally relevant needs of youth, and that there is consistency in ensuring that there are options for youth, not just in this temporary placement setting, but in longer term placements. Okay, she may or may not advance. I'm gonna have to stop share. Hold on a second. I'm gonna pause there and see if from the group there are any other elements that we talked about in the conversation that I missed, and also just open the floor for additional conversation around what might be included in considering making recommendations around temporary placements. Maybe we can jump off with you, Pam, and giving voice. I'm trying to see if Pam is still in the room. Yeah, giving voice to what you put in the chat.
Sure,
She's like,
thank you.
"What is the chat?"
Does that work for public comment now, Trace? If because I can just combine it all, or do you want me to wait? Yeah, I think that's fine. I think if okay, it's a small enough group, come on in, Pam. Okay, thank you. A couple comments about temporary placement as a provider of QRTP, but also word FRP, right? And so short-term temporary placements. Wondering if there was a current residential provider in this work group to be able to offer insight as to what some of the current struggles are today in real time. I'm not sure this idea matches the whole direction of FFPSA when we talk about trying to limit number of moves for clients and number of placements. As we hear from our kids who run, whether they are able to stay with us or not, it really is a sense of if they run and then they go to another place, they're just kind of building a new bridge again. And from a trauma-informed care perspective, is this the right angle to take? Is this the right pathway to take? Because each number of placements does impact a kid. As a provider running milieus, I would be concerned about a milieu of runners, right? Typically, we as providers might pick one or two runners at a time so that they're not all together with groupthink. Another quick comment supporting Beth's idea is that the length of stay, right now, our regular continuum for just the regular allotment of kids sometimes have extensions of length of stays because there's not another step down, right? There's not another placement to go to. So whether that's in our QRTP or even at our FRP where, the model is supposed to run for 14 days, but counties can't get the kids out long enough. So then we see an escalation of their behaviors because there's a loss of hope, a loss of connection, a loss of next placement. And so a lot of lessons learned from that. I'm not sure how 21 days is enough time or would have enough intervention to change the course or pathway of a run behavior. If we're talking about chronic runners, right, that really is probably more of a deeper dive into clinical issues. What's causing this behavior? How is the system helping or hurting that behavior? And so I just wonder if more of the pathway would be still concentrating on why are these kids running? What is needed for the kids and the current placements? How can we wrap around resources that way? And then I echo everything that Dennis had shared with trying to run a placement such as this. I don't know if that would be feasible for a provider. So thank you. Just food for thought.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all of that, Pam. Any reflections, thoughts on what Pam shared? I like that she lifted up, I think, some of the things that we've talked about in our subcommittee. I think one of the sort of realities of the ecosystem in Colorado is that, without a placement, these kids are in offices and they're in motels or, so, I think there is it sounds like an impetus to try to have some place that is safe, that is truly a placement that where they can actually do some clinical work, or even if that's starting to gain some insights into what prompted the run. But would love to hear from not just the subcommittee, but others in sort of just reflecting on what Pam shared, but also as you think about what might be important to include in recommendations around temporary placements.
Have we broached the conversation about locked facilities in this subgroup? I say that for a reason. There are a lot of kids that we're sending out of state right now from various referral sources. And I was on a call with some county folks last week and some providers, some CPAs, and it's very natural in those settings for a conversation to come up to say, hey, we have a kid that's been sleeping in our office for X number of weeks. Does anyone know where we can send this kiddo? And the response from several different counties, no shade at the county for this at all, but their response was, yeah, we're having luck with Utah, or we're having luck with Nebraska, or we're having luck with Tennessee or Texas. all of these red states that I think are probably having locked door options for folks. And so I'm just wondering, have we gone there yet in this group regarding locked facilities?
Beth, would you like to share some of our conversation around locked facilities?
I mean, so that was brought up, and then I guess I would defer to Dennis because it was one, like these facilities can't be locked that we're talking about legally. And so that's where it was like the staff secured was part of the discussion. Is that correct, Dennis?
Well, yeah, but we're looking at it pretty extensively. Like there is, like, we did find a locked facility in, I think, Tennessee, but I think they were just locking their facility. I don't think anybody knew they were, I mean, they just said, we lock our facility. I'm like, well, how do you know it's legal? And they're just like, well, we just have always done it. So I don't, we're looking at it to see what the parameters are around this.
And I'm guessing,
Because from my perspective, like if I'm looking at Southern Peaks, if my choice are the kid gets restrained or the gate gets locked, the kid can't get past the fence, I would way rather see the gate get locked, right?
yeah, and our conversation was just in regards to like the locked in regards to these temporary placement facilities.
Oh, okay. Well, we've been looking at it from a different peg. Like we've been looking at PRTF.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to your point, Becky, we did have some discussion around locked facilities. I think that there were concerns. I think that the point that was made earlier around kids' rights came up in that conversation, as well as the the question on what are the legal parameters around locked placements, particularly in consideration of these temporary placement options. And then shifted the conversation, sort of thinking about what might be a staffing model that could ensure child safety with these youth, particularly the youth that have a propensity for running. And I think Brandon's point earlier about the challenges, I think particularly when you look at existing workforce challenges and trying to maintain a staffing level appropriate to use staffing as a mechanism to keeping kids safe. Dennis?
So CDHS is going to be building a PRTF on the grounds of Fort Logan. And we have the blueprints for it now and everything, but my understanding is that that facility will have a locked perimeter fence most likely. But I don't know what that necessarily means for all of the other providers. Because it's just a very gray, murky area, legally speaking. So
Yeah,
and
thank you for that.
no one, I didn't mean to step on your toes. Sorry, Doris.
No, you're good.
Likes this conversation about locked facilities. It's a horrible thought, but so are restraints and so are kids running and getting hurt. So if it means a law change or a tweak at some point, I think that should be on the table with this group to consider. And Dennis, I appreciate that you guys are looking into it. I think it's a hard conversation and I think we need to be having it.
Thank you for that, Becky. And I think so. One of the other nuances I think that came up as we were talking about this topic is, so intervention is, the response once a youth has run away. And so we were looking at temporary placements in that vein, but also thinking about that intervention as a prevention effort for future runaway. And so then it gets murky, right? Like, so, not wanting to step on the toes of the work that's happening in the prevention conversation. But we also saw these in every conversation that we've had on the intervention side. We've been thinking about that intervention as a prevention of future incidents or future harm, future runaway. And then it gets, I think, murky and really wanting to sort of stay in our lane. But again, as we were thinking about temporary placements, we were thinking about them in the context of a temporary placement option for not all youth who run away, but for a subset of youth who run away, and likely mainly for those youth who run away who were, as I noted earlier, may have been trafficked, or we know that they had a history of being trafficked, for those youth who are frequent flyers. And so, really trying to get to that root cause, or at least start that, and or because they're at a higher risk of not being accepted in sort of like other placements. And so the need for a temporary placement option is likely more needed for those youth. So we're not talking about this as once every youth who has run away, this is where they would go. We were thinking and talking about it in a very narrow, with a narrow scope for some of the youth who run away who meet certain criteria. Dennis?
The biggest worry, I mean, I don't know clinically like what my concerns would be with a temporary facility, but my biggest concern would be, just from looking out at the placement continuum, is those beds would fill and stay full, and then you would not have that. You would need this, but it wouldn't be available because they would just be full all the time. That's I think something
and that
we'd have
came
to
up in our
careful.
Yep. And like PRTS now, which may be why they're building another facility. Beth?
All of our PRTFs are always full. They always have wait lists, correct?
I just think the importance of, talking to a current facility right now where it's like, okay, when they're reaching out to my team about these really high risk youth that are chronically running and what can we do? And I'm like, so what does it look like when they come back? And I'm being told that it's like, they just take their shoes. And
Well, they're actually not allowed to do that, but okay.
Okay. And not actually implementing or having the staffing to really get to the why. And so needing that dedicated space. And I go back to Pam, yeah, your comments were great of like, yeah, we did talk about that trauma informed piece of like hearing from youth of like wanting to know like where am I gonna be, and just constantly bouncing around from various placements. So wanting this landing spot where you are going to be receiving services and not just, hey, here's a bed. And then also looking at where it's like, okay, like where you were placed, either one, you've lost your bed, because we've talked about how that often happens, or the youth is describing like, hey, there's been some trauma from that facility, and hearing directly from the youth that this is not a good fit, and putting them in a safe environment where they can talk through their trauma.
Thank you for that, Beth. I want to check in, Dennis.
I just had a question for Beth. So in your experience, like for these older youth, like 17, like 16 and a half, 17, if we did have a facility that was like more independent living focused, that was like apartments, would that possibly mitigate some of this?
Yeah, I think so. And that's something that we're looking into on, partnering with Together in their new, I think it's like 58 apartments here in Denver.
So Third Way has a licensed facility that we're trying to figure out what to do with. I've been working with them to try to figure it out, but it's actually apartments.
Well, and yeah, my conversations with Third Way has been like more of their independent living is usually not where they're having issues for running.
Okay. All right.
I like your question, Dennis. I think it's a good thing we should be thinking about.
Agreed. As we come, oh, that's me echoing. As we come down to the wire, we have 6 minutes remaining. Any outstanding questions, comments, thinking around this temporary placement option as a recommendation for from the task force?
Hey, Doris.
Yes.
Yeah, I think my only question, and I'm not sure anybody can tell me, but what is the scale of this potential solution? In other words, do we know if this would apply to 10 kids per year or it applies to 45 kids per year? Does anybody have a handle around that? Like, who are those chronic individuals that you referenced, right? The ones that
Yeah.
would be the subset of the total number of youth who run from care. Any ideas?
I mean, I would love to open the floor to the rest of this group on what the scope looks like. From what I gleaned from our subcommittee, the answer is we're not sure, which is why there was the need to include the data component in being able to sort of forward going, being able to better identify the number of kids that we're talking about, the specific needs of those kids that we're talking about, and ensure that there is an appropriate continuum of placements for those youth who run. But I think the short answer is we don't know right now today.
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think the lowest hanging fruit solution or help would be to fully fund the QRTPs that we have right now so that they have the capacity to staff up with the number of people that they can hire up, which they can't right now because they can't afford it. So that would give us some capacity, you know, more staffing and all of that, I think would be, and I know Dennis, I'm preaching to the choir. I know that's Dennis's wish as well.
Thank you for that, Beth. What I said, Beth, Becky, sorry. All right. I think I'm going to pass the baton back to Trace to get ready to close this out.
Yeah, thanks, Doris. Thanks, everyone. Pam, I just want to make sure I'm not assuming, did you have additional comments you wanted to make, or are you good? Okay, great. Okay, well, seeing no other requests for public comment, we just as a reminder, like our homework for ourselves is we're going to take all this and put it into some form of recommendations and or guidance that you will have the opportunity to respond to as it relates to the report. And then we're gonna move on into our remaining directives. So just appreciate folks' conversation and also your attention to your inbox as you will have the opportunity to review things hopefully ahead of time before our next meeting. So Stephanie, any closing comments from you? And then we'll get out of here.
No, just thank you all. Good to see you, and we'll see you in the next round.
Thanks, y'all. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.